Our speaker tonight is Tim Gallagher. He was, for 26 years, the editor of the Living Bird magazine, which is in my house and many of our houses. And he's an award-winning author, a wildlife photographer. He has many books. I just wrote down a few names: Wild Bird Photography and Falcon Fever. And you can find all his books on Amazon if you want to read some of his books. Tim has been a falcon fanatic most of his life. He became interested in the Peregrine Falcon eyrie at Taughannock Falls, if I say that right. Taughannock, see, and we even practiced. Taughannock Falls. He's been interested in that since he was 12 years old. And unfortunately, the falcons stopped nesting there in 1946, but came back in 2020. And tonight we're going to hear about the history and his interest in these falcons. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, it's great to be here. And what a beautiful place. Yeah. So I for some reason, I got my mother had got me a copy of A.C. Bent's Life Histories of North American Birds of Prey. I think it was from the 1930s. And I saw this picture by Arthur Allen, and it's just so beautiful. It's still my favorite image of a peregrine falcon eyrie. And when I came out here to interview for my job at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology in 1990, when I was just about the end of the interview, I said, would someone drive me to Taughannock? I've always wanted to see that place. And Scott Sutcliffe, who was like the executive director then, he took me over there, and I was just amazed by it. And I just thought, boy, if only they still nested here. But anyway. So this is Arthur Allen. The picture with the trees is actually in Florida when he went out looking for the ivory-billed woodpecker, which even then they thought was extinct, and he found a nest. And it was a big deal, it was in the papers, and the bird's not extinct. What a big deal. And a couple of taxidermists read about it in the paper, and they went out and shot him, and had a collecting permit from the local sheriff. So that was a sad thing, but always an interesting guy, always interested in him. And another key figure in this is Louis Agassiz Fuertes, the famous artist, bird artist. I mean, people say he was like the Audubon of the 20th century, but I actually think he's better than Audubon. But if that's not sacrilegious. And he was I hate to talk about a rival club, but he was the president of the Cayuga Bird Club back in 1915. This is a picture of him giving a walk in our local park, and I don't know why that kid has a drum, but but that's what birders dressed like back in the day. And he was actually the first person who found that eyrie, the first person we know of who found that eyrie at Taughannock, actually in 1909. And this is a painting he did of it at the time. And I'm sure Arthur Allen was one of the first people he told about it. They were really close friends. And here's a picture of them that same year, and with Fuertes down below looking up, and Arthur Allen's climbing that tree to a sapsucker nest. The first sapsucker nest that was found in that area, and that's why where the Lab of Ornithology is called Sapsucker Woods. That is that same location. And Allen wrote an article about it for Audubon. Audubon magazine back then was called Bird Lore, and this is in 1913, and it's called the Duckhawks of Taughannock Gorge. Because of course they used to call peregrines duckhawks in America through most of the 20th century. And very in-depth article. And interestingly, that nest there, that site where it is there is very close to where it has been the last few years. It's not the same location where that famous picture was taken. Because, those cliffs, they're always sloughing off. And so I'm sure the original nest out there is gone, probably long gone. And these were some of the other pictures from the article. And back in 1920, Fuertes wrote an article for National Geographic it was about falconry, the sport of kings. And it was like 40 pages long with all these paintings of, Elizabethan falconers and Arabs and other people. But he also stuck a picture from Taughannock in there. Because that was everyone's favorite nest. Yeah, and sadly, he got killed in an automobile accident in the late 1920s. He'd just come back from a trip to Abyssinia doing all these beautiful paintings. And he went down to the American Museum of Natural History to visit with Frank Chapman. And on the way back, driving a Model T, there was a hay wagon in the road, and he drove around it, and there was a train coming by and got hit. And his paintings were all over the road, and his wife survived, but he was killed. And it's very sad. I don't know why Arthur Allen has a red tail, but so this is an interesting little side note that he wrote in the early 1960s. For years, I carried in my mind's eye a picture of the peregrine against the falls. And finally, when the peregrine moved its eyrie to the south side of the gorge, about 300 feet from the falls, my opportunity came. The nesting ledge was 40 feet down the perpendicular cliff and directly below a substantial lookout where I placed my blind. From here, there was a good view of the falls, but there was no satisfactory perch for the falcon anywhere in the vicinity. So with the help of Miles Perney, I hauled a dead tree to the edge of the cliff, about 30 feet from the blind, and attached it in such a way that the falls would furnish a background. So kind of cheating, not something people would get away with these days, but I'm glad he did it because I love the shot. He even did arrange it so the bird would be against the falls, the white, so it would show up more, Yeah. This is sad. This is another, he had a book, American Bird Biographies, and one of them that was about the peregrine, and this is from that. Often one of the birds was shot by an irate poultryman, but the survivor secured a new mate. And although the exact location of the eyrie sometimes changed, seldom, if ever, was Taughannock Falls without its peregrine until 1946. An ignominious end to a noble bird, killed as vermin and used as a scarecrow. And that's a Taughannock bird, and the fact that he said often, it wasn't like this happened once or this happened sometimes, it happened often. But fortunately, back then, there was enough of a floating population. There always, in a healthy population, there should be floaters all the time, ready to step in if one of the birds from a pair is killed or something happens to it. And that was the case until 1946. And this is a movie that he took in 1941 of the nest. But although 1946, people think that's early, I think they were victims of DDT and we just didn't know it yet. They started using it during the war and then using it heavily right after the war. And so it really fit with the timetable well. And, we think of Rachel Carson warning in Silent Spring of DDT and the effects of it. But, even much earlier, Richard Poe was warning of it in 1945. If DDT should ever be used widely and without care, we would have a country without freshwater fish, serpents, frogs, and most of the birds we have now. And because we didn't know then that it, it accumulated in these birds. The birds eating the insects had it in their fat, and then it really accumulated in falcons who were eating these birds, and it affected their calcium production, so they laid thin-shelled eggs. And Poe was an interesting guy. He worked for the Audubon Society and later was one of the first presidents of the Nature Conservancy. And he was he was the person who took those famous photographs of Hawk Mountain with all the hawks laid out dead. We think of Rosalie Edge, a wealthy woman who saved Hawk Mountain, bought it basically, but it was because of Poe. He gave all these talks to all these groups showing what was happening, and she was one of the people who saw his talk. And I got to meet him once and spend 4 days at his house when he was 99 years old, and so amazing talking to him about those days. He told me then he didn't expect to live to be 100, and he didn't. He died a couple of months later. But I don't know if you've heard of the Madison Conference in 1965. It was a huge deal in conservation. Joseph Hickey at the University of Wisconsin, Madison, there was rumors all over that peregrine nests were failing, not just here, but in Europe and other places. And he'd gone to many nests in the 1930s and was very familiar. And he wanted to find out what was going on. So he got Dan Berger and another guy from Wisconsin and encouraged them to go to as many nests as they could find in the East and see what was going on. And, you know, they took a Volkswagen van and spent 3 entire months just going, you know, New Hampshire, New York, even down to Alabama, all over. They went to 133 nest sites. And they went to them and they were looking with spotting scopes, stopping at each one, spending time, shooting a gun if they were still, you know, chase birds off a cliff. And out of 133 nests, none of them were occupied. And that's what spurred Hickey to just send invitations all over and set up this whole conference. And over the years, I've interviewed a number of people. There's only a couple I know of who are still alive, including Granger Hunt, who I saw about a week and a half ago in, you know, Boise, Idaho, and he's in his mid-80s. But I've gone to lots of scientific conferences over the years, and all of them, everyone's kind of dropping in and out of talks and having conversations in the hallway. What I've heard about this, no one did that. Everyone attended every talk and were just at the edge of their chair listening. You know, what's going on with these birds? And there's even, you know, Derek Radcliffe from England. He's the one that really, because people, is this being caused, are egg collectors taking the eggs, or is there a lack of prey? There's all these theories. And, you know, one of them was, of course, DDT. But Derek Radcliffe in England, he had slides that showed areas that were being sprayed, another slide showing where the peregrines nests aren't occupied anymore. And he sandwiched them together and stuck them in a slide projector, and it was lined up perfectly. So that kind of set a lot of people like that. But you know, Hickey he spread a wide net, and he had even people from the pesticide industry coming. And one guy was given a talk about it. Well, we don't have the day. We can't say that this, how could it possibly be wiping them out all over? Maybe 1 or 2 nests or never, but it's just and this one guy, Jim Rice, who was a falconer from Pennsylvania, he stood up and he said, damn it, east, south, northwest, it's pesticide, pesticide, pesticide. And people just got up and applauded. And right after that meeting ended, several of the people got together and formed this other group, what became the Raptor Research Foundation, which is now a world-respected organization. And they had a meeting right there. And Tom Cade was there. He'd been he was a professor at Syracuse University, but he was on a sabbatical and he was in Africa. But he came back for this. And he was part of the people who were thinking, we need to figure out how to breed these birds in captivity and get it going. And that's the only way we're going to be able to save them. You know, ban DDT, breed them in captivity, and try to replace them. But there wasn't really a history of breeding birds of prey in captivity. Even though falconers have been around for a couple thousand years, the only ones you could come up with, this falconer in Germany, Renswaller, in 1942, he happened to have a peregrine that had a broken wing, a male, and put it with an old female, and they laid a couple of eggs, and one of them hatched, and so that was about it. And then the late 1960s, Larry Schramm in Oregon, produced one young. And then Heinz Meng from here in New York, he really had some interesting ideas. He had at first tried earlier in the 60s with wild trap birds, trying to get them to breed in captivity. But it turned out you really need ones that are raised in captivity to accept it enough to where they'll breed. And he produced a couple of birds the first year, of the Peel subspecies from the Pacific Northwest. But the following year, it was like poultry science, taking the eggs away and they'll lay more, he double clutched them, and he got 9 birds from one pair. And that really, Tom Cade really embraced that. In fact, he gave some of the birds to Cade that he'd had, like including the breeding pair. And this was the old Peregrine Palace, or hawk barn, as we called it. And now, this is Jim Weaver, who became a real important part of the breeding project at Cornell. And but I happened to meet him. I met him I was 16, my friend was 17. We drove an old clunker car all the way from Southern California to Centerville, South Dakota, a couple of thousand miles, broke down a couple of times. Camped out at night, and because we wanted to go so bad. And Jim Weaver was there, and he let us camp out next to him and another guy, and their birds perched around us. And it was right next to a river, and it froze in the night. But that's a whole different story. But anyway, so but also many of the people, or at least the ones who were falconers too, who were at the Madison conference, were there. And they even had a follow-up meeting, and they had the first official meeting of the Raptor Research Foundation. And I sat in on all that. And at that point, I didn't even know these birds were endangered. And it just kind of made me want to become a conservationist. And this is actually me, about a month after that meet, I trapped a prairie falcon, which I flew for the rest of the season, let her go in the spring. But and this is Jim in the hawk barn. Now, he didn't originally have any plans to do that. He and a friend came up to Cornell just to look at the setup and what was going on. And there were some things about the structure he really didn't like. They'd use these dowels, wooden dowels for bars. Now with birds of prey, you always have vertical bars. If you put them sideways, they'll be grabbing onto them and breaking their tail feathers as they're holding on. So you do them vertical. But they did it with dowels, and he didn't like that because some had broken, and he replaced them with metal, and he made the purchase for them. And before you know it, he was there. He was there for the duration. And they really started cranking. And they take them off the bird, so they just keep laying more and more, and they'd put them in an incubator, and they'd perfectly humidify them. So, I mean, even if they're a thin-shelled egg, you can hatch them, if with the right setup with the incubator. And then they'd hand feed them at first, and I want this movie to go a little faster. But weigh them, keep track of everything with them. And it was just an amazing process. And lots of people volunteered to help with this. I mean, it's like, with the whole process. While this was going on here, I was doing stuff with the Santa Cruz Predatory Bird Research Group in California, trying to help the birds at Morro Rock, this giant, it's like the Rock of Gibraltar. There were only 2 nests in California that left in that time, and that was one of them, and they were failing. I mean, that was the first peregrine nest I ever went to in person, and the female that year died because an egg broke in her oviduct. So we started taking the eggs away from the birds and putting dummy ones in, and then we'd switch out the eggs for some young prairie falcons we had, and then the Peregrine Fund gave us some peregrines, so we switched them again and put real peregrines. So it was really a long process. And that's a view of Taughannock from above. Spectacular place. I always try to see it when I take off on planes out of Ithaca Airport. And that's Tom Cade on the left and Jim Weaver right above Taughannock. And this is the box they put in. Yeah, I can't imagine them letting you do that at a state park. And this is, it's called a hack site. And hack, you can read about this happening 1,000 years ago in medieval times. They were hacking birds. They'd get these young falcons from a nest, and they'd put them out on a hack box, sometimes up on a pole or sometimes on a cliff, and they try to arrange it so they couldn't see you giving them food, but they'd stay there and they'd keep coming back for the food and getting stronger and stronger and getting used to flying around and chasing stuff. But the deal was you had to retrieve the birds before they went off hunting by themselves. And so Tom Cade and the others, they turned this thing around, and yeah, this is what we want them to do. We want them to disperse. And so that's what they were always trying to do. And it worked really well in many places. Here you can see the guy is secretly dropping them some food down that long pipe. So it just comes out magically. Birds get a meal. Well, falcons like to hunt. And just because you're feeding them the stuff, it doesn't mean they're not going to want to go chasing stuff. They'll see stuff going by, they'll want to go after it. And just like their parents are feeding them at first. And, eventually they start taking off and flying around, doing their own thing. You can see a tiny radio transmitter antenna on that one bird because they wanted to be able to track them and see what was going on at any given time. And this was in 1975. It was one of the first attempts to release birds. And Taughannock, just like for me, it was a special place to Tom Cade and a lot of other people. We'd grown up with that picture. And so this was one of the first places he wanted them to return. Because if you release the birds there, there's a good chance they'll eventually come back and one or more of them and try to set up a territory there. Unfortunately, one of the birds disappeared and then another, and they released 3 birds, and they got their telemetry equipment out and were tracking down the beeper, and they found one of the transmitters inside a pellet from a great horned owl. It had eaten the young, so it had obviously eaten 2 of them, and they retrapped the last one. So that was unfortunate. And that's why they started releasing a lot of these birds in the city. because there's less chance of them getting nailed by great horned owls. And out west, a lot of birds were getting nailed by golden eagles. And especially ones that didn't have parents or anything, they're just being released. They were, you know. So the thought was, if you get them nesting in cities and really reproducing well, those ones are eventually going to go out into the countryside and nest in natural sites. And that's what happened. That's what happened. That's Jim Weaver again. He got around back in the day at a Colorado eyrie. Oh, and that's Taughannock, where I was talking about, where I'd done that work years ago. And I went back there in 2021. You can see on the one on the left, the peregrines flying out of that nest hole. That's where they were nesting way back in the late 1960s. But we also found a nest on, oh, this is backwards in my thing. Okay. We also found one over here. The one nest was here, but we found one here at the same time. And then someone told us that there was actually another one on the seaward side. So here, this used to be one of 2 nests in California. Now there's 3 on Morro Rock. So huge success. And they're nesting tons of other places up and down the coast, and plus in buildings and everything. But something interesting happened in spring of 2020. The birds came back. And they raised 3 young. And that was a very special moment for me. I mean, yeah, the first time in 74 years that they'd nested at that site. And several local photographers got nice shots of them. This one's kind of funny. You can see the vultures there, but there's also right in the water, the peregrines are taking, peregrines love water, and they're just splashing around at the top of the falls. I wish I'd have been there and seen that and gotten that picture. And I wrote an article about this for Audubon back then. And then it won an award from the Outdoor Writers Association for best conservation article. Then the following year, they raised 4 young. Can you see the 4 there? There's 3 sitting up and there's 1 lying down on that horizontal. So they really have become entrenched in this place. Year after year, they've been here. Here, you know, the male is on the ledge and the female has just taken off. She's like saying, hey, it's your turn. I'm sick of it. Because 90% of the time you see on the eggs that it's the female, and it's she'd had it. And this was, you know, May 14th last year, not far from now. Yeah, sometimes I'm there with my camera and I'll snap a shot with my phone. Just one of my daughters is a major birder, and I have to send her stuff sometimes. Well, you see the bulging crop on him. He was so tame. I mean, he must have been 20 feet away up in this tree with this full crop just sitting there. I don't really want to fly, man. But well, that brings us to this year. They were nesting slightly later, like a week or so later than usual, but I was there. I was there on early in April and saw them on incubating 4 eggs. And then they were hatching later. I think the last time I'd gone there was like the 22nd, and it looked like one egg wasn't any good. But a friend of mine, Gio Kloppel, he took this picture on the 23rd, which that day I was flying to Idaho, where I spent a week. And you can see the one egg that didn't hatch and some chicks underneath her. This is just a digiscope shot he took with a spotting scope. But sadly, I came back, and as soon as I got back, the very next morning, I went to look at the nest, and it was empty. And I asked around, talking to people, and a great horned owl was seen in the vicinity. And it looks like that's what happened. I had been worried this year about the possibility of avian influenza, but I don't think that was it. Because if one of the parents had gotten sick and died, or the young, they'd probably be dead, but they'd be there, and that egg would be there. But it was like there's nothing there. And so I think the nest got raided. So we had 5 really good years, getting at least 3 or 4 young each year, and that's great. And I don't know what's happening now. It doesn't seem like they'll re-nest again this year. It's kind of late now, but I'm just hoping for the best for next year. So I don't want to end on a sad note, but I was very sorry. Tom Cade was a really good friend of mine, and we went to Greenland together about 26 years ago. And I can't say enough good things about him. He spearheaded all this thing, this whole recovery and reintroduction of the birds, and just an amazing person. And sadly, he died the year before the birds came back to Taughannock, because I know he would have loved it. And but anyway, I'd be glad to hear any questions you have.
Yeah. Wait till you get the mic so that folks online can hear. Are there any? I'll ask. Mm-hmm.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I have a question. Do you have any theories as to why they returned in 2020?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's hard to say for sure whether because they had already been coming into other areas, like they were like overpopulated in New York City, and then they started, they're nesting on every bridge between New York and Albany now, but they also, the Shawgunks and the Catskills and the Adirondacks, I mean, it was just a spreading thing. And, but on top of that, that was the COVID year. And suddenly we had a really small population. All the Cornell and Ithaca College students, they went home and just studied remotely. And you go to Taughannock and be empty, at a time when it used to be packed with. So it might have been really, really attractive, more than usual. But so some combination of those two things. And once they were entrenched there, they've stayed. And I think it's the same pair. The male is real distinctive looking to me, and the female has always looked the same. So he's an unusually looking color, plumage, but I think it's the same pair. And they've put out enough young over that 5-year period that some probably survived and would come back and nest if necessary. I mean, I think we probably have a good floating population now.
This is a setup, Tim.
I know you want to know something about Bobby Harrison, right?
Yes. Well, he's coming here via Zoom, I believe. But can you talk a little bit about your last trip down south to find the Ivory-bill?
Yeah, we were, I think it was in end of March, early April. I spent about a week and a half down there with Bobby. out in, I don't know how much you know about the whole Ivorybill woodpecker thing. And I wrote that book, The Grail Bird, about the search we had and about a sighting we had in 2004. And so we were going back to check on Bobby's nest, cameras that he'd set up all through the swamp. And it was so good to be back there in the swamp and with Bobby. His wife had passed away a couple of years ago, and he was crushed, and he didn't go out. And these cameras hadn't even been looked at for a couple of years. And we went out there, and it was just like old times, like 25 years ago, out together. And he's a great speaker, by the way. I hate to admit that. So we've been kind of rival. Some of our best talks is when we were together and we just tease each other. And, it's kind of the North and South thing. He's from Alabama. But yeah, he's a great guy. And I highly recommend his talk. And I don't know if you were asking about this in particular, but there was a point where we got one of the cameras down and we looked at the movie from it. And some young hunter kids had come out there and were just talking, what the hell is this? And kind of giving us the finger and cussing us out and this and that. And the guy finally says, he goes, oh, Ivorybill Woodpecker Foundation, what's this? And so they're looking for woodpeckers? Why would they think they'd be looking for? And he looks back and there's this tree that's all peeled, bark peeled from a woodpecker. I goes, oh, geez. Yeah, that was funny. So, but I think their mother would be mad if she heard the language they were using.
Yeah, we got a question here.
Yeah, so what is the consensus with the Ivorybill? Are they gone or are they still around?
There is no consensus.
There's no consensus.
Depends who you're reading,
Yeah.
But I can tell you this. When I was working on the Grail Bird, and before it even was a book project, I mean, I was sort of doing an oral history, and I was agnostic about whether the bird still existed or not. But I thought, if it's extinct, we need to talk to all these people from the 30s and 40s who saw it and ask them any questions that we have while they're still alive. And so that was my incentive. But while we were doing it, we were finding people who'd had more recent sightings than 1944. I mean, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. And sometimes these were hunters who just sit in a deer stand all day dressed in camo or at the base of a tree, hunting turkeys and stuff that birders don't do, where they would have a better chance and they'd have really good descriptions. And that was interesting. And we were doing a lot of following up on those kind of things. And then I heard about a guy, Gene Sparling, a kayaker, who had a really believable sighting 4 days earlier. And I tracked him. I was always tracking people down, doing this switchboard.com, putting in a name and getting a bunch of people the same name, calling them all up, and most times they go, I'd say, yeah, I'm Tim Gallagher from Cornell, and I want to talk about the Ivorybill woodpecker sighting he had in 1956. And they usually say, what the hell? I go, sorry. So I was really like a salesman doing cold calls, but anyway, I talked to Gene and he sounded really believable. And I told Bobby about it and he called him. And then Bobby says, I'm going, I think he's on, I'm going down there. And so, I had just gotten back from a couple of months there. So, but my wife encouraged me to go. So, I flew down to Memphis and he picked me up going from Alabama to Arkansas. And we were going to spend a week in the swamp, just floating the length of the bayou and camping out at night. And really just in the afternoon of the early afternoon on the second day, we had a bird coming up this side slough, and then flew right across 70 feet in front of us, swinging up to land on a tupelo with all, perfect description of an ivory bill, white all the way to the trailing edge of its wings. And just, and of course he said, ivory bill, scared the hell out of the bird. It flew off. And we were just, crashed the canoes in the side of the swamp and abandoned it and climbing over logs, ripping our clothes. And Bobby just, he finally, he can be an emotional guy. And he just, I just saw an ivory bill and started crying, and I was just shocked. And then Gene came back. I don't know where he'd been up ahead looking for stuff. And I just said, let's not talk to each other. Let's write down our notes. And then I gave my camcorder to Gene, and he was interviewing it. And, at the end of it, Bobby says, I just saw an ivory bill. And I said, it's a lifer for me. And Gene says, well, welcome to the Sasquatch Club, gentlemen. So I wasn't a believer till then. And maybe I'd be more skeptical now of other people's sightings if I hadn't had one that to me was unmistakable. And I thought, the swamps were at their worst stage in the 50s. So wherever this bird's from, whatever it was doing, it got past that bottleneck. So I think there's at least some left, I believe. What? 2004. And next year, yes, February 2004. And later, David Leno got a video that I think, these are always terrible videos, but he was keeping his camcorder going constantly. And he didn't even see this bird. He's coming up, they're checking stuff, and he's using a little tiny electric trolling motor, which these were really good in the canoes because, when you're paddling like that, you're scaring birds, like wood ducks taking off 80 feet in front of you. When you got the trolling motor, they get up like where those chairs are right there. And so it's a whole different deal. So they're like that. And he reaches back and lifts his trolling motor up so it clicks, in the upright position, and that spooked that bird, which had been peeking out at him. And so they got it going. And it's got a ton of white on its wings. And we were even doing stuff like making models like of a pileated woodpecker and an ivory-billed woodpecker, and making them go up and down, flap their wings, and filming them with that same camcorder. I don't know. Everything pointed to that bird they saw being an ivory-billed, but I don't like these movies that are coming out all the time any better than anyone, but one of those most recent articles, I saw some pretty interesting video from a drone though, where, it's so tiny, but where you can see the black down the back and, but so I don't know if that answers your question, but I think there's still a few around.
Is that the only location in America, just that particular swamp?
No, because that latest thing people did was in Louisiana. And I think there's a chance in Florida even. There's such vast areas that people never go to. You can see some of them were collected in the mangroves and places like that, and there's endless mangroves, Now you had a question, right? Yeah.
About food and the falcons.
Okay.
Are they running out of food, their preferred food, where they're nesting successfully?
No.
And can we get any falcons or owls to live in the city and get rid of some of our rabbits?
You mean in Rochester? Probably. Well, I don't know. I have owls living in my village, Freeville. Yeah.
Rabbits in every backyard.
Wow.
Producing.
Well, they're kind of cyclical because yeah.
Country deer taking out your plants, but city, they're stripping the bark off the rose bushes and the.
Well, I've got deer and rabbits in my yard. So and owls.
Are they running
No.
plenty of ducks and
Oh, yeah, yeah.
pigeons? I know in New York City, but
No, I mean, I went there so often and seeing them eating all kinds of things, even blue jays and swallows and, you know, a lot of pigeons, a lot of pigeons.
Thank you. It's good to hear that that these falcons are doing so well. Could you mention perhaps maybe something that you see as emerging threats over the next few years or 10 years that they may be facing?
Well, my biggest fear is avian influenza right now because I know this has periodically swept through populations and they've bounced back and it hasn't been too bad, but the particular kind we've experienced the last couple of years is just incredibly bad. And I actually wrote an article about what's avian influenza, highly pathogenic avian influenza. I wrote an article for Audubon about this last year, I think like September or so. And because a lot of the coastal eyries, like in New Jersey and Virginia, those are really well monitored and they've trapped they've all got bands. So they know when the replacement happens, when the floater has to come in and take over. They know it. And usually the ones who come in are also banded because they've banded so many birds over the years there. And the turnover rate has been staggering in those areas along the coast where they're eating waterfowl, which there have been heavy die-offs of waterfowl and also shorebirds. And some eyries weren't even occupied at all. There was one that had a juvenile female, and that's unusual where they're so desperate that a juvenile will be brought into a pair. And it's also happening on Washington and the San Juans. I know a researcher there and they're just completely hammered there. But a lot of waterfowls go through there and they've had a lot of die-offs. And also up on the Yukon River, I know a guy, Skip Ambrose, who has been studying those birds there since the early 1970s. And even when he's about 80 years old now, he retired and he and his wife bought a boat so they could keep doing it. And, from the DDT days till just 4 years ago or so, it was so good. And now they're going down again radically. And this is a worry for me. And a friend of mine, I did some work once in Iceland with an Icelandic researcher with gyrfalcons and went to all these banded 56 young gyrfalcons, climbed a bunch of cliffs. And now they've had big die-offs of gannets and fulmars and things like that. And the gyrfalcons are dying off. People have taken pictures of them eating a fulmar, or a gannet, a huge gannet, and those birds are just going to go off and die. So it's really having a staggering effect on Icelandic gyrfalcons. That whole country is only the size of Ohio. So these are my worries.
Yeah.
Are there any other active breeding programs going on at Cornell now?
Well, there's the Cornell Raptor program. They're not breeding birds to release though or anything. I mean, sometimes they've done some breeding experimentally. I don't know about recently, but when John Parks was directing that, he at one point bred sharp-shinned hawks and Cooper's hawks and even goshawks just experimentally and just released them after, because they're more challenging to work with than falcons. But I don't think there are any release programs anymore. Whether there would be in the future or whether, I have all these wild thoughts like, if this gets really bad, maybe we have to start inoculating these birds, keeping the birds in captivity for a month, inoculate them a couple of times and let them, I don't know. This just seems incredibly deadly. It seems like if they eat something that is sick with this, they're going to die. The viral load of eating the flesh of an infected animal is just got to be staggering. So that's my, hoping for the best, fingers crossed. Yeah.
Any other questions? Any online? All right. Well, Tim, thank you so much. It was